Tonight at St. Pius, we are having Steve Ray. If you listen to Relevant Radio, you're probably familiar with Steve Ray. He's a convert to the Catholic faith and a very excited Advent promoter of Catholicism. So he will be on Relevant Radio today about 10, I think. Yeah, he's going to be on 2 or 3 times. And then he will be at Pius tonight, starting right after the fish fry. So I think it's, if you come at 6:30, you'll be on time. If you come at 5:30, you can have fish and really be on time. And it's a couple of hours tonight and then 2 hours tomorrow morning. So I know walk-ins would be welcome over there. There's plenty of room at St. Pius. So please join us if you're free. I know you'll have a good time, and I have to work it, so I'd love to see your faces. Good morning.
Good morning.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord Jesus, please be with us this morning as we stand with you, as you stand in trial. Help us to grow in our appreciation for what you suffered, and please give us the strength to stand up for the truth in whatever circumstances we are called upon to do that. And we pray together. We adore you, O Christ, and we praise you, because by your holy cross you have redeemed the world. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. If you would take your Bibles and go to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 22. They had arrested Jesus in the garden, the temple guards, led by Judas, and now they go up the steps to the high priest's house. I told you about those steps last week, right? I'm never throwing away my shoes because they literally walked in the footsteps of Jesus up to the high priest's house. This is still nighttime, okay? And so we're on chapter 22, and we're beginning with verse 66. It's at the end of the chapter where we start this morning. After the trial, led before the high priest during the night, it was kind of a private.
Sister,
Yeah.
could you push the lamp thing down because it's covering your face? I mean, it's a gooseneck lamp, isn't it?
Yeah, then I'm gonna,
Ah. Don't, sorry, never mind. Never mind.
I can't help it. Okay, Jesus would have been tried at the high priest's house, but it's an unofficial examination. And this happens during the night. They lead him from the Mount of Olives, down the hill, through the Kidron Valley, and it's like a second entry into Jerusalem. The first entry on Palm Sunday was a joyful experience to some extent, because Jesus did have his own crowd cheering him and praising him. But this is the second entrance in the dark of the night with soldiers around him, the Jewish temple guard. And they go into the city, they go to the high priest's house. Remember I said the steps are big blocks of stone, and they've never been replaced over the years. So when we walked up those steps, we were literally walking in the footsteps of Jesus. They go to the high priest, and it was a private, unofficial examination. Its purpose was to trip him up so that they could charge him with something. And after that, he was handed back over to the temple police for safekeeping. And you know, the scriptures do not tell us anything else. When we go on to chapter 23, we're in the morning. Okay? I'm sorry, we're in the morning. It says, when day came, the council of the elders, etc. What happened during the night? The scriptures do not say. But when we were in Jerusalem, there is this church called St. Peter Gallicantur. And it's got two steeples on it, one with a cross on top and one with a rooster on top. It's close to the high priest's house, and that's where Peter would have denied Jesus. Inside that church, which is rather new, inside that church, up toward the front, but not in the sanctuary yet, you come to a place where there is a big gold railing, a little bigger than the size of your tables, not much bigger. And you look down, and all you see is black, because you are looking into a hole that goes 3 stories down into the ground. And that was the dungeon where they kept Jesus. And what they would have done is tie a rope under his armpits, flung him over the railing, dropped him down 3 stories into the ground. And there may or may not have been somebody else down there. But that's where he was for all those hours, let's say from before midnight, maybe 11 o'clock at night until 6 in the morning, something like that. For hours, he would be down in that dungeon. And the guard at the top would have held the end of the rope, and then he could do anything he wanted. He could move Jesus' body any way he wanted, and he could walk him like a dog. Down in the pit, in the dungeon, it was very cold, it was dark, black, and Jesus would not be able to sit down because when people were there, obviously for hours, the floor would have human waste on it. So it would smell, and he would not dare sit down, but he could slide and slip and trip. And the guard at the top would be teasing him, ridiculing him, uttering insults against him for hours. And you know, if I ever get back to the Holy Land, I doubt that I will, that's one of the places I would like to go to again, besides Mount Tabor and the Jordan River and the Church of the Visitation.
And the Nativity.
You know, but that was one of the places that impressed me the most, because today you can take a crude stairway and go down there. And it is crude, it's stones, and somebody did fall, got all black and blue across their face. And of course she was going to a wedding when she got home in a couple of days, so she was black and blue, like a raccoon. Very treacherous steps, but we took those steps down into that room, and today there's one light bulb there, so you can see where you are. And what do? You know, you're standing in this room, and you know that Jesus stood here. And this is where he was insulted and ridiculed and twisted and turned by the guy at the top who's holding the rope. And it made me think of the tremendous experience of loneliness that Jesus must have felt. That, you know, where is everybody? And he's stuck down 3 stories into the ground. Where is everybody that followed me? And he's all alone with his one guard who's abusing him. have you ever felt that way? Have you ever said, am I the only one who believes? Am I the only one who goes to church? Am I the only one who whatever? When I feel like, when I've said that, it's like the loneliness, the tremendous loneliness of Jesus down there in the pitch dark, cold, offensive smell in the place, being ridiculed. Have you ever felt that much alone? And I'm sure, I'm using a book for my prayer during Lent, and what the bishop says, who wrote the book, it's an old book, goes back to 1950, but I love it. But what the bishop says in that book is, Jesus' soul was developed to its fullness in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus' soul was developed to its fullness. And therefore, he did go forth from that garden. No matter what they did, he went forth in control of the whole situation. And so even down here in the pit, he somehow has control, and the guard cannot ridicule him to the point of breaking down and falling to pieces mentally or psychologically. He's still in control of the situation. Okay, then if you look at verse 66, it says, when day came, the council of elders of the people met, both chief priests and scribes, and they brought him before their Sanhedrin. They said, if you are the Messiah, tell us. But he replied to them, if I tell you, you will not believe. And if I question, you will not respond. But from this time on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God. They all asked, are you then the Son of God? He replied to them, you say that I am. Then they said, what further need have we for testimony we have heard from his own mouth? Okay, that word Sanhedrin, what is that? And I found some really lengthy information about that. The Sanhedrin was like the Supreme Court of the Jews. It had complete jurisdiction over the religious and theological matters. It was composed of 70 people, which included scribes, rabbis, Pharisees, priests, Sadducees, and elders. They were all represented on it. Just keep in mind that when we hear that name Sadducees, they are the wealthiest people among the Jews. Okay? And elsewhere in the gospel it says the Sadducees did not believe in resurrection from the dead, but the Pharisees did. The Sanhedrin could not meet during the night. And it did meet in what was called the Hall of Hewn Stone, H-E-W-N, the Hall of Hewn Stone in the temple court. Picture the temple court with big building in the middle, which was the holy place, and then like a square or a rectangle around, which had different halls. The Hall of Hewn Stone is where the Sanhedrin met. The court sat in a semicircle. Facing the court stood the prisoner. So you have a semicircle with all these 70 people looking at you, and then the prisoner stands there facing them. Behind the prisoner There also were rows of students and disciples of the rabbis. So, in a sense, the prisoner was right in the center of it. He's got this court of 70 people, and behind him are seated rows of students and disciples of the rabbis. Any one of those were allowed to speak, the students and disciples were allowed to speak in defense of the prisoner, in defense of him, but not against him. Okay? All charges had to be supported by the evidence of 2 witnesses independently examined. So whatever you're charging this person for, 2 people have to have evidence and they're questioned independently. A number of the court might speak against the prisoner, or a member of the court might speak against the prisoner and then change his mind. So you could speak against the prisoner and then later come forward and say, no, that's not true, it's not what I said, not what I meant it to be. You could then speak in defense of him. So you could be against him and then change your mind and be for him. But if you spoke for him, you could not turn around and speak against him. You couldn't change your mind. If you said he's innocent, you could not change your mind and say he's guilty. But if you said he was guilty, you could change your mind and say he's innocent. So there's kind of a protection here for the prisoner. If you at first spoke for him, you're not allowed to speak against him. But if you speak against him, you can change your mind and speak for him. So there's a protection for the prisoner. When a verdict was due, each member had to give his individual judgment, beginning with the youngest. And so that would be, I guess, quite a roll call. You got 70 people sitting there. And there's Jesus standing there, and 70 people, their name is called, and they say yes or no. For acquittal, a majority of only 1 was needed. Only 1. For condemnation, a majority of 2. So again, mercy on the prisoner. For acquittal, 1, but a majority of 1. For condemnation, a majority of 2. A sentence of death could never be carried out on the very day it was given. And for Jesus, they're going to bypass that rule. A sentence of death could never be carried out on the day it was given because they would give them a night to think about it in case anybody would change their mind. They did not give Jesus that chance. But all of these things were designed for mercy. And so from Luke's gospel, it's clear that the Sanhedrin is not going to exercise that mercy. They're not going to wait until the next day. And very likely, the reason they're not going to wait till the next day is because it's Friday. And the Sabbath begins this afternoon. And then you'd have to wait an extra day. And so they're not going to allow that. And so the charge that the Sanhedrin finally produced against Jesus was the charge of blasphemy, claiming he was the Son of God. And so they ask him two questions. Are you the Messiah? And Jesus says, if I tell you, you will not believe. He doesn't say yes or no. If I tell you, you will not believe. Then they ask him, are you the Son of God? And he says, you say that I am. So he's so clever, he will not answer them. It's like, figure it out for yourselves, listen to your own talking, yes or no, and you figure it out. So I'd like to pause for a moment and ask you at your tables to again go back to Jesus in the dungeon. Is there any situation in your life where you have felt you're the only one who believes, or the only one who practices? Talk about that at your table. Do you have any story to share about that?
Boy, I don't recall anything that Elise said that would have been fortunate to be around. Well, I think that's gravitating, nurtured people who think like we do.
But you're absolutely right.
Do you have any women friends that challenge you on? Well,
Yes. Yeah, right. They paid for my lunch yesterday with an organ donor card. Cost me an arm and a leg. My kids. And I don't want to hold them with it. I just feel I need to get rid of them. But yes, it's, I have no idea, and it's something no word.
I just can't remember.
Later.
You know what people are, back to this, they're saying the church has changed. They don't believe what they do. They don't have to believe this and all that stuff. I said, the church doesn't change. And I know you.
Well, she was working on her tip. Hey? No.
Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna get him.
Okay, if you would bring your sharing to a close, and you are all talking about your own experiences of loneliness, right? You are not reliving Lorenzo Kane's catch in the center field yesterday. Okay? We're all talking about our experiences of loneliness, and sometimes it happens, just for, you might just feel for a minute or two, am I the only one in this room that believes, or am I, sometimes I shared sometimes in my past teaching, I just felt, am I the only one in this class that believes, Anyway, pay attention to that, pay attention to that. And sometimes as you're watching television and you're watching the news or whatever, you might think, how small is the group of believers today? As you watch the culture paraded in front of you as you watch television, don't you sometimes get the feeling, we as Catholics are so small? We're so outnumbered. Well, then we can identify with Jesus in the dungeon. Okay, now, after that, we get to chapter 23, verse 1. Then the whole assembly of them arose and brought him before Pilate. They brought charges against him, saying, "We found this man misleading our people. He opposes the payment of taxes to Caesar and maintains that he is the Messiah, a king." Pilate asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Again, Jesus said to him in reply, "You say so." Pilate then addressed the chief priests and the crowds. "I find this man not guilty." But they were adamant and said, "He is inciting the people with his teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee where he began, even to here." So Pilate is staying at the Antonia fortress. Now you have the temple area, which is a large tract of land, and behind that, on a hill, is this Antonia fortress looking down over the temple. It was a solid building, but it was not very large. And, sometimes in movies when you see Pontius Pilate, you see him, coming out on a big platform with pillars and all of that, a huge area. It was really quite small, not that large. And the street in front of it was narrow and winding, so that a few hundred people could fit into that space, not thousands of people. It's not a wide avenue where thousands of people could gather. It's a narrow street, you could get a few hundred people. The leaders of the Jews met Pilate at the door of his house. Why at the door? Why didn't they go inside? Pilate is not a Jew. Pilate is a Roman. Anybody who's not a Jew is called a Gentile. Okay? Anybody who is not a Jew is called a Gentile. It is against the law. It was against the law to go into the home of a Gentile. If you set foot in the home of a Gentile, you became impure and unfit for worship in the synagogue or the temple. So they met Pilate at the door. And they accuse him of three things. They had no power. The Jews have no power to carry out the death sentence. So they have to go to Pontius Pilate, who's the governor of Judea. And Judea is that southern district where the city of Jerusalem is. So they changed their tactics. They never mentioned the word blasphemy. When they go to Pilate, they do not say Jesus blasphemes, he calls himself the Son of God. Why not?
It doesn't care.
Pilate could care less. I'm not a Jew. Condemn your own people. If it's about religious stuff, deal with it yourselves. I'm not a Jew. I don't believe in your God. I don't follow your rules. I'm from the Roman Empire. I'm to keep law and order in this place. If it's a religious matter, go back and deal with it yourselves. However, they couldn't deal with it themselves. Why not?
We're allowed to. We're allowed to.
They're controlled by the Roman Empire. The Jews cannot put anybody to death. So they're stuck. The Jews would not be allowed to put anybody to death. If you're going to have capital punishment, the death sentence, it's got to be given out by the empire that controls you, that rules you, who has power to do that. So they're stuck. We can't kill him. Only the governor can kill him, the Roman governor. But he could care less about our religious matters, so we've got to accuse him of something else. And they accuse him of three things. Seditious agitation. In other words, he's acting like a revolutionary. Okay? He wants to, and a revolutionary would be one who would want to get an army together and overthrow the Roman government. Jesus is involved in that. Yeah, right. But that's what they accuse him of. They accuse him of encouraging people not to pay tribute to Caesar. Is that true? No, because in another part of the gospel, Jesus says, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, give to God what belongs to God. So Jesus isn't doing that at all. Then they accuse him of attempting to assume the title of king or Messiah. Is that true? Did Jesus demand that people call him king? No. Did Jesus say, I am the Messiah? No. In fact, in one of the gospel stories, when people attempted to make him king, after he had performed a miracle, they attempted to make him king. What did he do?
Disappeared.
He disappeared. He went and hid. He vanished from their sight. Probably went to his place of prayer. And so the three things they're accusing him of did not happen. And so Pilate resorts to plan B. And the clue here is they say, he is inciting the people with his teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee where he began even to here. Now, Pontius Pilate is not the governor of Galilee. Okay? He's the governor of Judea, the southern province. But when he hears the name Galilee, that's when his ears perk up. Because it was known in that day that there was a lot of revolutionary activity going on in Galilee, in the north. There was a lot of unrest, a lot of people trying to start uprisings, a lot of revolutionary activity going on. Oh, Jesus is from there. Well, then he might be a revolutionary, and we would have cause to put him to death. But Pilate's not sure. So what's plan B? charge of Galilee? Herod. So we send him to Herod. Herod, now, did Jesus have to go back to Galilee to meet Herod? No, it was very, Pilate knew this is Passover time. The Jews are all congregating in Jerusalem. Surely Herod is here in Jerusalem for Passover. And so Herod is not far away, and he sends him to Herod. Now, who was Herod? I have this big book called the Dictionary of the Bible. And I looked up the name Herod, and there are so many Herods, and then there was a chart drawn of who descends from who. At any rate, it gets confusing. At any rate, there were several people in Jewish history that were called Herod. This was Herod Antipas, Antipas. He was the son of Herod the Great. He was Tetrarch of Galilee, and as such, he had rebuilt the city of Sepphoris. Now, Sepphoris is not too far from Nazareth. In fact, we think that St. Joseph and the men of his time would have had to go over there and build the buildings in that city. So they were working for the Romans. Herod also founded the city of Tiberias. Tiberias is located up a hill from the Sea of Galilee, and that's where we stayed for 2 or 3 nights. 2 nights, I think. At any rate, you could sit out on the balcony at night and just look down over the Sea of Galilee. It was so cool. There are no Jews who live in Tiberias. Okay, there's only Arabs that live there today. And in Jesus' time, the Romans would have lived in Tiberias. The Jews would not. Okay? And so he acted as a spy for the Emperor Tiberius at the time. And he would spy upon Herod, would spy upon the Roman soldiers. What does that have? Happens because of that. There's enmity between Herod and Pontius Pilate. So Herod's overseeing the building of Tiberias, and he's, spying on the soldiers, and that brings enmity between him and Pontius Pilate. So what about being a tetrarch? It meant he was the ruler of a region. This Herod was not a king. He was a satellite prince who ranked just below the rank of a king in dignity. So Jesus goes before Herod. If you would look in your Bible. On hearing this, Pilate asked if the man was a Galilean, and upon learning that he was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was in Jerusalem at the time. Herod was very glad to see Jesus. He had been wanting to see him for a long time, for he had heard about him and had been hoping to see him perform some sign. He questioned him at length, and he gave him no answer. The chief priests and scribes, meanwhile, stood by, accusing him harshly. Even Herod and his soldiers treated him contemptuously and mocked him, and after clothing him in resplendent garb, he sent him back to Pilate. Herod and Pilate became friends that very day, even though they had been enemies formerly. Pilate then summoned the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, and said to them, "You brought this man to me and accused him of inciting the people to revolt. I have conducted my investigation in your presence and have not found this man guilty of the charges you have brought against him, nor did Herod, for he sent him back to us. So no capital crime has been committed by him. Therefore I shall have him flogged and then release him. And so Herod regards Jesus, and he just makes a fool out of Jesus. He regards Jesus as a spectacle, a sight to be gazed at. He regards Jesus as a joke, and he refuses to talk to him seriously. And he thinks that Jesus is of no importance. Jesus again is silent. And the silence of Jesus was its own form of reproach. In its own way, he was evangelizing Herod and Pilate by not talking. He was forcing them to think for themselves. He was not going to come outright and say, I am the Messiah, I am the Son of God. I stand before you and you figure it out. It was a call to Herod to stop and reflect. And at that point, no words and no miracle could have convinced Herod. There was nothing Jesus could do or say that would bring about a conversion to Herod. It was he was too far gone. Jesus was nothing to Herod. So nothing Jesus could say or do would convince him. You know, Pilate says, I shall have him flogged. By that we mean the scourging. And you know what the scourging was like? You know, they had the man with his hands tied to a post. And the soldiers that came at him had long whips. And at the end of the whip were several strands of rope. And at the end of each of those strands was tied a piece of animal's teeth or bone or some sharp piece of metal, so that when they struck the person, it stuck into their skin and it gouged out. So many criminals just died right there. Maybe I shouldn't say many, but some did. They died right there at the post, being scourged. And if you saw the movie, The Passion of the Christ, you got 20 minutes of that in the movie. And it showed in the movie that the soldiers took a running start and then, whipped. When the prisoner got done, his back was just raw flesh, the whole back. And you can imagine some of that, if they had long hair, some of that got stuck in their hair and they'd be yanking at the head. They may have missed the mark and hit him on the side of the face. It was awful, okay? So we come then to the sentence of death. But all together they shouted out, away with this man, release Barabbas to us. Now Barabbas had been imprisoned for a rebellion that had taken place in the city and for murder. Again, Pilate addressed them, still wishing to release Jesus. But they continued their shouting, crucify him, crucify him. Pilate addressed them a third time. What evil has this man done? I found him guilty of no capital crime. Therefore I shall have him flogged and then release him. With loud shouts, however, they persisted in calling for his crucifixion, and their voices prevailed. The verdict of Pilate was that their demand should be granted. So he released the man who had been in prison for rebellion and murder, for whom they asked, and he handed Jesus over to them to deal with as they wished. Now looking back, Pilate had made 4 attempts to release Jesus. First of all, he told the Jews to settle the matter for themselves. Then he tried to refer the whole case to Herod. Then he tried to persuade the Jews to release Jesus as the prisoner released at Passover time. And then he tried to compromise, saying he would have Jesus scourged and then have him released. So Pilate 4 times made an attempt to either release Jesus or punish him and then let him go. Now, in looking at the record of Pontius Pilate, he had a 10-year history as governor of Judea. And the records show that he came forth as a man who was amoral, meaning he didn't have a morality, insensitive, and pragmatic, which meant, pragmatic means you do the practical thing to do. And it looks like the practical thing to do in this case is to give the Jews what they want. Under Roman justice, any province had the right to report a governor to Rome for misgovernment. Pilate had already made 2 grave mistakes while ruling over Palestine. By Palestine, I mean Judea. He had already made 2 grave mistakes, and I didn't take notes on that, but there was something in the book I was using that explained the mistakes that he did make. So he had already made 2 grave mistakes. If he makes a mistake now, what? He's out of a job. He's going to be reported, okay? So his future is at stake. The positive efforts he was making to save Jesus were out of character. This was not like Pontius Pilate. It was not like him. I mean, the pragmatic Pontius Pilate immediately would have said, to keep peace, we'll condemn him, go ahead, we'll crucify him, and you can stop nagging me about it. The pragmatic Pontius Pilate would have acted like that, but making 4 attempts to release him is out of character. In the end, the people compelled Pilate to sentence Jesus by holding the threat of an official report to Rome over his head. So he sentenced Jesus to death in order that he might remain governor. So the one thing the Roman government could not tolerate in its empire was civil disorder. So Pilate cannot stand to have civil disorder going on. It's going to be reported. I will be without a job. So it's Jesus, the Holy One of God, facing Pontius Pilate, who now becomes, very self-centered. I want my job. He's nervous. He's already made 2 big mistakes. He's very nervous, and it's my job against the life of an innocent man. If you go to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 19, verse 15, it says that 2 witnesses are required for a declaration of guilt or innocence. And in this case, there were 2 witnesses, a pagan, who was Pontius Pilate, and a Jew who was Herod. And they both attest to Jesus' innocence. Herod makes fun of Jesus, but he can't say, and he doesn't say you're going to be killed. Pilate makes 4 attempts not to get him killed, so you've got 2 witnesses not condemning Jesus, and Jesus gets condemned. And in the end, Pilate does not issue a guilty verdict. He gets himself off the hook. He turns Jesus over to the people to deal with him as they wished. And so because the people are screaming and yelling for Jesus' crucifixion, Pilate gives up and says, you can have your way. Did Pilate say, you're guilty, I condemn you? No. So the question becomes, who condemned Jesus? The people were yelling for it. They wanted him condemned, but they're Jews and they have no power. And Pilate has the power, but he turns Jesus over to them. In a sense, you could say nobody condemned him, and in another sense, you could say everybody condemned him. By the very fact that Pilate does not exercise his office. He relinquishes his office, his authority to condemn. By the fact that he does that, he does condemn Jesus indirectly. So as you look back at what we've talked about today, again, talk at your tables. What did you hear today that was new to you, or that you want to, that made an impact on you, or what impression do you get of this whole trial?
Well, I have felt all along that he was considered a rebel that was caused political problems. And the religious aspect of Herod or Pilate, I think they were more concerned. This guy is a Zionist and is going to give us some trouble.
No, and it's not a religious. Yeah, like
I sense there's more emphasis to say the people were responsible.
yeah, they already said the Jews did it.
They're Christians.
Yeah.
Because he was pragmatic and gone out on a limb.
No, if he's going to turn over Barabbas, who obviously was sentenced already for crimes, and going to reverse that and give them the person he feels innocent, that's a big mistake.
Barabbas was actually convicted
Well, I think mentioned that the area around Galilee was a hotbed of revolt against the Romans. And so I
Right, Pontius Pilate will be forever remembered because every time we pray the creed, he suffered under Pontius Pilate. And I think I'm correct in saying that in the end, somewhere down the line, Pontius Pilate was put in exile on an island in the Mediterranean. And down the line somewhere, Pontius Pilate was sent into exile, so he didn't retain his place and his name for too long. Anything else anybody wants to mention? Yes?
I don't know where I heard this, but I heard someplace that Pilate eventually converted through his wife, and that in maybe the Eastern Church, he is considered a
I
convert.
have no idea. Did
should
Pontius
research
Pilate
that.
convert? I have no idea.
I heard that he was sanctified by an Eastern church
Yes.
eventually.
So he's Saint Pilate.
Oh, that's interesting, I didn't know that. Anything else anyone wants to add? I hope that as we're going through this, when we actually get to Palm Sunday, not Good Friday, when we get to Palm Sunday, this is the gospel that will be read to us. This is the Passion account, the Passion according to Luke. I hope as the Passion is read, some of these details will come back to you. The whole trial is just a messy affair, a real messy affair, because you're dealing with someone who truly is the Messiah and the Son of God. And isn't it ridiculous that he would have to go back and forth? The high priest, the dungeon, the Sanhedrin, then Pilate, then Herod, then Pilate, and nobody able to say, I condemn you. Just a victim of indecision, maybe indifference, and it's possible that there were Pharisees in the midst of the crowd pushing people to yell for his crucifixion. You yell for his crucifixion or else. And so visitors to Jerusalem, if they had not known Jesus, they would have like, huh? Well, okay, we'll yell for his crucifixion if that's what we're supposed to do. It's possible. There were people in the crowd who never had met Jesus, never had heard about him, and they're yelling for him because they're threatened that they better do so. All of that mess is the picture. And in the middle of the mess, Jesus is condemned. And next week we will go to the way of the cross. Thank you.
That Pilate was exiled to an island.
She said that.
She just said that.
She said that.
I'm reading the Smithsonian.